Imagine lying in a hospital bed, surrounded by doctors and nurses you trust to save your life. Now imagine that the very person adjusting your IV isn't there to heal you, but to kill you. For over 16 years, patients in New Jersey and Pennsylvania hospitals died under mysterious circumstances, their deaths written off as natural. But behind the curtain was one man in scrubs, quietly becoming one of the deadliest serial killers in American history. His name? Charles Cullen, the nurse who murdered from the inside. You're about to hear the story of one of America's deadliest medical serial killers. But before we begin, make sure to hit like and subscribe, because you won't want to miss the other dark and twisted cases we have coming up. In the sterile white hallways of New Jersey hospitals, the quiet hum of machines often signaled life. But in the late 1980s and throughout the 1990s, that hum was frequently followed by the sudden, unexplained silence of death. Patients who were stable one moment collapsed without warning the next. Their charts showed nothing unusual, no clear medical explanation for their sudden decline. Doctors chalked it up to the natural unpredictability of medicine. Families grieved quietly, trusting the system. Yet behind those walls, a predator was at work. Hidden in plain sight, dressed in scrubs, carrying a syringe that could kill as easily as it could heal. That predator was Charles Cullen, later known as one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Charles Cullen's story began long before his first patient death. Born in 1960 in West Orange, New Jersey, Cullen was the youngest of 8 children in a working-class Irish Catholic family. His childhood was marked by loss and instability. His father died when Charles was only 7 months old. His mother, his closest confidant, was killed in a car accident when he was 17. Trauma seemed to follow him everywhere. Bullied at school, rejected in relationships, and prone to bouts of depression, Cullen attempted suicide multiple times in his early life. After a short stint in the Navy, marked by erratic behavior and another suicide attempt, he left and enrolled in nursing school. Nursing seemed to give him purpose, but beneath the surface of his medical training, something darker was brewing, a compulsion to control life and death. In 1988, Cullen took his first job as a nurse at St. Barnabas Medical Center in Livingston, New Jersey. Within a year, strange deaths began to surface. Patients who weren't critically ill suddenly coded. One, a judge recovering from an allergic reaction, died under mysterious circumstances. At the time, no one suspected Cullen. He was quiet, diligent, and seemingly committed to patient care. But behind the curtain, he was experimenting. He had discovered that a lethal dose of digoxin, insulin, or epinephrine could stop a heart within minutes and leave behind little trace. Later, Cullen confessed that his first victim was a judge named John Yengo, whom he injected with a fatal dose. It was the beginning of a murderous spree that would stretch across 16 years and at least 9 hospitals. Cullen's killing method was chillingly simple. He would slip into a patient's room, inject a drug into their IV bag, and walk away. Hours later, the patient would die, and it would look like natural cardiac failure. Hospital mortality rates quietly rose wherever he worked, but the healthcare system failed to connect the dots. Instead of reporting him to the police or the state nursing board, hospitals often chose to quietly dismiss him when suspicions arose. Why? Liability. Hospitals feared lawsuits and reputational damage. So Cullen simply moved on, finding new employment in a different hospital, free to kill again. By the mid-1990s, nurses and doctors began whispering. Staff noticed that Cullen's patients seemed to die at an unusual rate. At Warren Hospital, 3 elderly women reported seeing a nurse inject something into their IV bags before they died. Cullen was on shift during each incident, yet administrators hesitated. Investigating a nurse meant admitting the unthinkable, that a caregiver was a killer. Cullen took advantage of this silence. He transferred from hospital to hospital. St. Barnabas, Warren, Hunterdon, Liberty, Somerset, Lehigh Valley in Pennsylvania, and finally Somerset Medical Center. At each stop, his trail of victims grew. For families, the deaths were devastating, but not suspicious. Who would imagine that a nurse, someone entrusted to heal, could be the one causing harm? When 91-year-old Eleanor Stoddard died suddenly after showing signs of recovery, her family was told it was natural causes. When 21-year-old Michael Strenko collapsed after surgery, doctors assured his parents it was a tragic but ordinary complication. No one suspected that Charles Cullen was slipping through the cracks of the system, one hospital at a time. By the late 1990s, Cullen's compulsion had spiraled. He later admitted to killing to put patients out of their misery, though many victims were not terminal. Some were recovering, some were young, some were elderly but stable. His killings were not mercy, they were control. Estimates of his victims vary. Cullen himself admitted to about 40. Investigators believe the number could be closer to 400, making him one of the deadliest serial killers in American history. It wasn't until Cullen arrived at Somerset Medical Center in 2002 that his crimes began to unravel. By then, he was addicted to killing. Patient after patient coded unexpectedly, despite stable conditions. The hospital's pharmacy system began flagging unusual drug orders. Cullen was accessing medications he shouldn't need for his patients. Epinephrine, digoxin, insulin, drugs linked to the sudden deaths. Pharmacist Phyllis Crockett noticed the pattern and raised alarms. Soon, hospital executives grew uneasy. But once again, rather than go straight to law enforcement, Somerset Medical tried to handle the issue internally. Cullen's undoing came through a colleague, nurse Amy Loughran. She had worked alongside him, never suspecting his secret. When investigators approached her with suspicions, she was horrified. Loughran agreed to wear a wire and gather evidence. In conversations with Cullen, he admitted more than he realized. Her bravery gave prosecutors the leverage they needed. On December 12, 2003, Charles Cullen was arrested after finishing a shift. He didn't resist. In fact, once in custody, he began talking, and he didn't stop. Cullen confessed to killing patients across multiple hospitals. He described, almost casually, how he injected drugs into IV bags, knowing any patient who received them would die. He gave investigators names, dates, and methods. Yet even in confession, Cullen was evasive. He often claimed he didn't remember exact numbers or details. Sometimes he framed his killings as mercy. Other times he admitted he simply felt compelled. For investigators, the horror wasn't just what he did, but how many deaths he couldn't or wouldn't account for. In 2006, Charles Cullen was sentenced to 11 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. His cold demeanor in court, his lack of remorse, and his occasional smirk enraged victims' families. Judge William H. Value declared him a cowardly killer who betrayed the most sacred trust in society, the duty of a nurse to heal. But even after sentencing, questions lingered. How many more victims were buried in his past? One of the most disturbing aspects of Cullen's case is not just his actions, but how the system enabled them. Hospitals failed to share suspicions, fearing lawsuits. Background checks for nurses were limited, allowing him to move freely. Mortality spikes were dismissed as coincidences instead of warnings. Experts argue that Cullen could have been stopped after his first few murders if hospitals had acted decisively. Instead, his career stretched nearly 2 decades. To this day, no one knows how many patients Charles Cullen truly killed. Estimates range from dozens to hundreds. Many medical records from the 1980s and 1990s are incomplete, making it nearly impossible to know the full toll. For families, the lack of closure is unbearable. Some may never know that their loved one's death wasn't natural, but the result of a nurse's deadly choice. Charles Cullen's story is one of betrayal, not just by a man who vowed to save lives, but by a system that failed to protect its most vulnerable. He was not the stereotypical killer lurking in dark alleys. He was the nurse holding a patient's hand, adjusting their IV, offering comfort. And yet behind that mask of compassion was a man driven by compulsion, leaving behind a trail of silent victims. His case forces us to ask unsettling questions. How could this happen? How many others like him might exist? And can the healthcare system ever truly guard against a predator in scrubs? If this case shocked you as much as it did us, hit the like button and make sure you're subscribed for more true crime stories every week. And I want to hear from you. Do you think Charles Cullen was a mercy killer? Or was he simply evil hiding behind a nurse's uniform? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.